If you're watching this video, it's because you probably expressed interest in the rent-to-rent strategy. Or maybe you're actually already in the rent-to-rent strategy, but you actually want some guidance. Well, for those who don't know me, my name's Ezekiel, and I actually specialize in the Airbnb strategy. I've been doing rent-to-rent for a number of years, and it's actually what allowed me to leave my full-time job. I used to work full-time in a primary school, helping kids with special needs. But then I was able to take on 10 properties in 10 months and be able to get myself out of that position of working in a primary school. And now years later, I've scaled past 20 properties and I've helped hundreds of people along the way actually kickstart their own journey. So for those of you who are not aware of the strategy, let me explain. Now, rent to rent is a very lucrative strategy. It's a strategy that some people actually can't believe is true. Because with this strategy, you're essentially taking a property that you don't own, you're taking it from a landlord or an agent, and you're using it as a company let. So again, with rent to rent, you're taking a property that you don't own, but you're using it on platforms like Airbnb and Booking.com. Now, many people know rent to rent as the Airbnb strategy, or some people just call it Airbnb. Airbnb is a platform that you list your property on. The same way Booking.com is also a platform that you list your property on. So when it comes to rent, you would always need funds. Despite the myth, many people think you don't need money. You need money. Whether it's your money or someone else's money, you need money to take on a deal. Now, it depends on where you are based. I'm based in London, so for me, I will need probably around the 8K mark. But some people may be based in other areas like Birmingham where it's a bit cheaper, and they could get in probably around the 5K mark. Now, some people, if they don't actually want to find deals themselves, then they may need to pay an additional cost, and those will be to people like deal sources. And deal sources on average can charge around 2.5 to 3K on average. But again, you need to factor that in when you're taking on a deal. So if you can't be bothered and you don't have the time to look for deals, then you will add that 3K to the 8K, for example, which is 11K. So again, that's when the cost can creep up. However, with rent to rent, you don't necessarily need much more than that, because you're just going to pay the rent, the deposit, and the furnishing. So this money, this is what it is. The rent, the deposit, the furnishing. So let's say a property is 2K rent. You're now going to pay 2K deposit on average. So that's 4K. And then let's say you need to furnish it. That's another 3K. So that's 7K that you're going to need to take on that deal. So if you found that deal yourself, all you need is £7,000. And if that property is in the right area, you could potentially be making in excess of £1,000. My most profitable property is making in excess of 1.5 a month. In the summer months, it can hit 2.5, 3K profits. And to be honest, I've managed to build relationships outside of Airbnb and Booking.com with insurance companies, whereby they pay me a premium to accommodate their guests. This month alone, I've actually accommodated a guest where the profit I'm going to be making is £5,000. So yes, you can make a lot of money from properties you don't own. I'm making £5,000 profit from a property I don't own. That's one property. So again, you can see how scalable and how much money you can make from this very strategy. A lot of people have the misconception when it comes to property that you just need a deposit to buy down a house and that's the only way you can make money. That's not true, because I've used this very strategy to leave my full-time job, and it's what's allowed me to be in the position that I am today, where I've also helped hundreds of people do the exact same thing. So yeah, this is essentially what you're going to need to take on a property: rent, deposit, and furnishing. And again, if you pick it in the right location, you would be in a good position. Now, another thing with rent to rent that a lot of people actually don't understand is education. You need to educate yourself. A lot of people unfortunately have the misconception that they will look online, get a property, list on Airbnb, that's it. If you do that, you're going to lose money. There's a case that I took on a property and I was actually losing over £1,000 a month because I didn't do the correct strategy. So again, make sure you know what you're doing. And with rent to rent in itself, there are so many different types of rent to rent. There's rent to HMO, where you're doing it on a room by room let. Let's say you have a 5-bed house and you're renting out each 5 rooms to different tenants. That's a HMO. There is service accommodation, or as many people know, which is the Airbnb strategy. So another strategy that I use and a lot of people do use is a service accommodation strategy, also known as the Airbnb strategy. And again, this is a very lucrative strategy. With this one, you're essentially taking a property on a long-term let from a landlord and you're renting out that whole property on a nightly rate. For For example, you take on a property, it's £2,000 rent to the landlord, and let's say you're renting out for £200 a night. And that is a live example of a property that I actually have. The rent to the landlord is £2,000 and I'm renting out for £200 every single night, which means that after 10 days, I'm actually making my rent money back, which means I have the rest of the month to again cover the bills and again make more profit. When you have a rent to rent and you take on a property on a guaranteed rent, you're responsible for everything. You're responsible for the maintenance, you're responsible for the bills, and you're responsible for the rent. And this is why it's so important for you to pick the right property in the right location. Because if you pick the right property in the right location, then you would make consistent money. So again, with this strategy, it's all about location. Pick the wrong location, and then you may be put in a situation where you're struggling to pay rent. When you're taking a property for service accommodation, we always go off percentages. In the summer, you might hit 90% occupancy, or in the lower periods, you might hit 50% occupancy, which is, let's say, 15 days out of a 30-day month. However, on average, you'd go through 70%. So in the middle between the 90 and the 50%. And this is how you work out how much money you could potentially be making. So again, 70% occupancy is 21 days out of a 30-day month. So when you're calculating your percentages, let's say it's £200 a night, you will do 200 times 21 to see how much you could potentially make. And then whatever the answer is, then you are going to minus that from the rent. So whatever the rent is, you're going to minus that, and that will the rent and the bills actually. You're going to minus that, and that's what your profit is going to be. So again, this is a very lucrative strategy, but it's important that you actually have the right education and you know what you're doing so that you don't lose money. Another strategy that a lot of people do use is social housing or supported living. Now, this is another strategy that I actually teach, and it's a more passive approach. Social housing is essentially when you're taking a property and you're giving it to a social housing provider and they essentially guarantee your rent. Supported living is quite similar. These are not easy for the average person to just go in and do. The reason is because you need the right connections. If you have the right connections, then you have these people that you can rely upon. But for me personally, I would always take a property for service accommodation, and worst case scenario, I can give it to a social housing or supported living provider. With service accommodation, it's very common for you to make in excess of £1,000 profit a month. With social housing supported living, some of the properties might be making, let's say £400 or around that per month. But again, it's more consistent and it's more passive. So it depends on the type of person you are. If you're somebody who wants to get your hands dirty and you're willing to take a risk and you're willing to obviously put in the time and effort to actually learn how to find deals, then service accommodation will be perfect for you. If you're somebody who's more passive and doesn't necessarily have the time, then you may need to get a deal sourcer. A deal sourcer would be costly, but again, if you have the funds to do so, then it could be easier for you. And again, you may need somebody to manage the property. But once you know how to manage a property yourself, I think you'll realize that it's far easier than you realize. Because personally, with me, I didn't actually want to manage the properties myself, but I actually realized that, you know what, it's not as difficult as it seems once you know what to do. You always have to be creative. And again, I understand when it comes to the rent to rent strategy, you have to be very creative. Some people might look at this figure of 8K and say, hold on, that would mean that after 8 months, I would then be able to take on another property. That is not the case. And that's not what I done. I took on 10 properties in 10 months. I scaled aggressively. The reason I was able to do that is because the money that I made from my Airbnb business, I kept recycling into the next property. I scaled aggressively. And another reason why I was able to do that is because the more knowledge that I had in this strategy, it meant that people who had funds around them were happy to invest in me in order to give them a return. And again, that is something that you're able to do if you have the knowledge. Now, for some people who are looking for that extra knowledge and they might not have it elsewhere, that is something that I do offer. So if that was something that you were interested, feel free to drop me a DM on my Instagram, which is _EZYproperty.